The Plan de San Diego embodied the most bizarre irredentist conspiracy in American history, and it led to the bloodiest and most controversial episode in the history of the Texas Rangers. The plan, or manifesto, reflected the practice in Mexico of any self-respecting revolutionary movement being accompanied by a manifesto denouncing those in power and setting forth the aims of the rebels. Such a plan was named for the locality where it was first promulgated. The Plan de San Diego were purportedly signed on January 6, 1915, in the small South Texas town of San Diego, population 1,900. The provisions of the plan were truly breathtaking. It established a provisional directorate and designated one Agustin S. Garza as the military chief of the revolutionary movement. The document then laid out the movement's specific objectives, of which I will read only a few. On February 20th, 1915, at 2 a.m., there would occur an uprising against the United States government to proclaim the liberty of blacks against the Yankee tyranny that had held them in iniquitous slavery since remote times, and to proclaim the independence of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and California, of which states the Republic of Mexico was robbed in a most perfidious manner by North American imperialism. Every foreigner who shall be found armed and cannot prove his right to carry arms, continues the plan, shall be summarily executed regardless of his race or nationality. Every North American, by which is meant Anglos, over 16 years of age shall be put to death, and only the aged men, the women, and the children shall be respected, and on no account shall the traitors to our race, La Raza, the Mexican Americans of South Texas, be spared or respected. To understand the situation in January 1915, a bit of lower Rio Grande Valley history is necessary. From Texas independence in 1836 through 1900, the population of the region was predominantly Hispanic, at least 95%, and isolated from the rest of Texas. The closest ties were with Mexican communities across the Rio Grande, and traffic back and forth was largely unhampered. But beginning in 1904, with the arrival of the railroad in Brownsville, the area was now linked by rail to the rest of the nation. This meant that the rich soil of the region, when supplemented by gravity and pump irrigation from the Rio Grande, could produce huge quantities of truck crops for a national market. People poured in, determined to make the desert bloom. As of 1915, the lower valley had approximately 140,000 acres that had been cleared of brush, planted in crops, and watered by an enormously expensive network of some 1,200 miles of canals distributing water pumped from the Rio Grande. This extraordinary land boom inevitably created problems. As the historian of South Texas, Evan Andrus, has noted, the few Anglo settlers who had arrived in the 19th century had melded into the society and culture of the region. They learned Spanish, joined the Roman Catholic Church, married into the leading Hispanic families, socialized, and did business with local elites. Furthermore, they often assumed responsibility for the employees, assisting them in a variety of ways. By doing so, these Anglo elites won the personal loyalty of their employees. By contrast, the multitude who arrived after the railroad was completed refused to learn Spanish and despised Hispanics, whom they viewed as ignorant and lazy. Furthermore, they paid the prevailing low wage scales, but unlike the predecessor Anglos, they would not deign to assist their employees. They even refused to associate with the Hispanic elite, viewing them as social inferiors. What occurred was a monumental clash of cultures, not unlike the one that had produced the independence of Texas in 1836. The Plan de San Diego was the spark that produced a violent explosion. And that is from the outstanding book, The Texas Rangers and the Mexican Revolution, by Charles Harris and Louis Sadler, published in 2004. I'm Josh Treviño, and this is The Hard Country.
Everyone, and welcome to the Hard Country podcast. My name is Melissa Ford. I'm a policy director at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I'm joined by Josh Treviño, the foundation's chief of intelligence and research. Thank you for reading that passage, Josh. I thought it was super interesting. One of the things that stands out to me is that you talk about this kind of coming together of Texas and the clash of cultures that happened. So in the passage, if I'm understanding correctly, we have this lower valley that was very isolated. I think 95% Hispanic is what you read.
That's right.
And then we have the rest of Texas and this very stark difference before and after this railroad in Brownsville, right?
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit more about that and why it's relevant today?
The lower Rio Grande Valley has always been a kind of a world unto itself, and in a lot of ways that continues into the modern day. And we should be clear, for those of you who are not Texan, or even for those of you who are not from South Texas, that the Rio Grande Valley is a geographic expression, not actually technically a valley. What we're really talking about, and there's some disputation as to where the valley begins and ends, but effectively, if you're talking essentially anything downriver of Roma out in Starr County, you're talking about the Rio Grande Valley. If you're at Laredo, not the valley, sorry, but the valley. And so when we think of the valley, we're thinking of Cameron, Hidalgo, maybe Starr and Zapata counties, and then all the settlements therein. And so what Harris and Sadler are describing is a region that gets settled with the Escondon settlements in the mid-1700s, middle of the 18th century, and ends up essentially an isolate region from the rest of the United States, certainly for basically the entirety of the second half of the 19th century, until the railroad comes in 1904, at which point it is actually linked in a meaningful economic way to the rest of the United States. And so what you have is the growth of this big fruit industry in South Texas. So, Texas grapefruit becomes a big thing, and it actually rivals Florida in a lot of ways for kind of that activity for a long time, although it never self-brands to the same extent that Florida does, because there's other things going on in Texas. But what you see is because it's a cultural isolate, because it's also effectively an economic isolate, and it's still, I think you could argue, to a tremendous extent, kind of a suburb of Monterrey out in Nuevo León, Mexico, which is the real manufacturing, industrial, and even finance powerhouse of the region there.
Right.
That you see this persistence of sort of old settlement patterns and connections that endure, certainly endured to 1915, definitely endure in the year 2023. And with it, when you have an influx of new inhabitants, there is friction, there's social tension. And so the Anglos and the Mexicans come. I think there's kind of an effort to make a morality play out of a lot of this idea that there's sort of these oppressive Anglos who come in and sort of put their boots on the neck of the Mexican American population, and we should be clear in understanding what happens in history with that. It's a mistake to look at history writ large in almost any context as a morality play. There are some exceptions to it, but certainly in the context of Texas history, there's a lot of cross currents. As we saw, there were elements within the Mexican population in South Texas at the time who were perfectly willing to advocate for a genocide of Anglos. And what we didn't read about, although this is what the Harris and Sadler book is really about, is the extent to which state law enforcement, in particular the Texas Rangers, conducts a counterinsurgency. There's really no other word for it, that is candidly savage in its scope and reach and sanguinary character. And so this is all part of and kind of the reason that we care about it now is it's all part of a larger picture as Mexico, in the period, contemporaneous Mexico, which is the Mexico of the Revolution, 1910, really through the early 1920s, descends into anarchy and political tumult. This Plan de San Diego, and Harris and Sadler talk about this in this book, was definitely not written in San Diego, Texas. Anybody who's been to San Diego, Texas knows that there's, at least the last time I went through there, which admittedly was about 6 or 7 years ago, it had a single stoplight, and there's just not...
I didn't even know there was a San Diego, Texas.
There is a San Diego, Texas. It's not like San Diego, California, but it's one of these small farming communities that used to exist, and so that part of Texas, you think about San Diego, Alice, Hebronville, places like that tend to be fairly self-contained. They're in a very remote and quite difficult area. It's difficult to ranch, it's difficult to farm, and so it's always been sparsely populated. That will probably continue to the end of time. But this document, all the evidence that we have, and I don't think we have conclusive historical evidence on it, was probably ginned up by Carrancistas or people affiliated with Carrancistas in Mexico, and then there's this effort to take the tumult of the Mexican Revolution and export it to Texas, and it goes extremely badly for all parties concerned.
Yeah, interesting. And you think the relevance of this passage and the relevance in general is just that it's important for people to be aware of what's going on in Mexico, because obviously it affects a lot of what's going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's exactly right. That there has been, this is something that you and I have experienced, especially when we talk with, USG personnel who are involved in Mexico-related policymaking, many of whom, are good, diligent people who want to do their best by the citizenry of the United States.
Right.
But we know that there's a traditional policy preference at the federal level for sort of, what I'll call decoupling. This is my phrase, not theirs, of what's going on with Mexico from Mexican relations to the U.S. So effectively, we're not going to get involved in expectations of Mexican governance in return for good relations on Mexico, for example, in trade and security, or we're not going to link trade and security, or we're not going to link Mexican civil society with good relations with the United States in general. And so the effect of this decoupling, one of the effects, and it stems from a good place, like there are defensible reasons for this decoupling. I would argue that it fails in the current era because the nature of the Mexican state has changed. But one of the effects is that we tell ourselves, which is a falsehood from a historical standpoint, that what's going on in Mexico doesn't really necessarily matter. It doesn't matter if Mexico is, say, an authoritarian dictatorship or run by cartels or anything else, as long as we have, say, border security or control over migration or anything like that. All of which are tremendously important. I'm not denigrating those. But what I want to illustrate with this particular reading is that ultimately that's that's sort of a falsehood that we tell themselves. When Mexico goes to the place where it went in the Mexican Revolution, to the place where it may be going now, the effects in Texas, the effects in the United States are unavoidable and serious, and they look like things. I'm not making a prediction for the modern day, but historically they have looked like things like the Plan de San Diego. And so the question that we ask ourselves 100 years later is, how do we not get there?
Yeah, I agree. You can't decouple them. And I think that's a good way to go ahead and segue into what is happening in Mexico, because it's important for us to be aware, right?
Right.
And so I think that a lot has happened since the last time that we filmed this episode. So
Too
we'll
much.
have a lot to talk about.
Yes.
But one of the more recent events that happened last week is just this absolute chaos about AMLO's health, right? And I think anybody who is involved in Mexican politics or knows a little bit about Mexican politics has heard of this. But for those listeners that don't know, last week was absolutely crazy. And that's because the Mexican president, López Obrador, he kind of disappeared from the public eye for just a couple of days, and people were freaking out.
That's right.
Everybody was told that he had just gotten ill with COVID for a third time.
Yeah.
And that he was fine, that his condition wasn't serious, that he was just social distancing. But people were still freaking out and rumors were flying. And I mean, even you and me, we heard things like he had a heart attack. We heard that he was paralyzed.
That's right.
People were asking us if we knew whether he was dead or not. And so it was just absolutely insane. And I think it's interesting that people are so willing to jump into conclusions when it comes to a lot of the time, like authoritarian presidents. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's there's a lot of questions at play here. So you're right. So he goes to Veracruz. So at the time of this recording, this is 2 weekends ago. Mm-hmm. He goes to Veracruz and he delivers this almost this jaw-dropping speech. He's actually there to commemorate the, I forget what the anniversary is, but
109th.
like 109th. Oh, thank you. Okay, so the 109th anniversary of the American occupation of Veracruz. For listeners who don't know what that is, just the very abbreviated version is that Woodrow Wilson, possibly one of our worst foreign policy presidents of all time, made the choice in 1914 to have the United States Navy occupy the Mexican city of Veracruz because at the time he wanted to put pressure on the regime of Victoriano Huerta. Excuse me. We'll move past that. Anyway, it's not a fondly remembered moment in Mexican history, and it was probably a pointless action on our part too, but so be it. So he goes and he commemorates this anniversary, and in the course of his speech, he actually says that, effectively, this is my paraphrase, but I would defend it as an accurate one, that if the United States decides to, violate Mexican sovereignty, which I'll put in quotes, violate Mexican sovereignty by attacking criminal cartels, by attacking narco bosses and so on within Mexico, that the Mexican state and the Mexican people we'll fight the Americans, which is an astonishing thing to say. It's one thing to have that message kind of communicated sort of quietly or just emphasizing that it's not something the Americans should do, but to get out and to say it overtly that we will fight the United States if the U.S. comes in looking for chapitos or whomever else is astonishing. It is the president of Mexico choosing a side. So he does this, and the news of that, which doesn't get far, by the way, because again, the United States doesn't really have a press corps at this point that's equipped to either cover or understand what's happening in Mexico, which is a cause for great regret. But then he immediately gets ill, and the last that we see of AMLO is him being sort of led away. He's clearly looking, for those of you who've seen the press photo, he's clearly looking quite ill, and he's getting on a plane, I believe it's a naval aircraft, to take him back to Mexico City for intensive medical care. And so it's within 48 hours after that that you and I start getting texts and WhatsApp messages from people saying, hey, did you hear AMLO's dead? And at first, I was astonished. I was like, are you kidding me? AMLO's dead? Well, he's not dead. He's just disappeared. And it is this very interesting sort of Soviet-style like information bubble around the leader's health. Now, we know from the Guacamaya leaks that AMLO's health is bad to begin with. He's had, cardiac issues. He's had issues with COVID. And so, and he's an old man in general, and is just not in robust health. But for him to disappear the way that he disappeared, and for nobody around him to appear to have any answers about it, fuels the speculation. And I think there was probably about a 48-hour period, I won't speak for you, but for me, where I felt a lot of dread at it, because, of course, the successor to AMLO
is much worse.
Yeah. Do you want to tell listeners who that is? Yeah.
Yeah. So when he was sick, he left his interior minister in charge, Adán Augusto, who is his cousin.
Yeah, Secretario de Gobernación.
Yeah, and also used to be the governor of Tabasco.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And so we know that he has like all these aspirations to replace AMLO. He wants to be the next president. That's his dream. But it was very interesting, and I think that the time that he was replacing AMLO was actually really good for him because it made him rise a little bit in prominence. A lot of people didn't know who he was.
It got people thinking about him as president.
Yeah, I got asked like, oh wait, who is it? And he got to answer some questions at press conference. He got to do a lot of that. But can you tell us a little bit about why he's so bad?
He is terrible. AMLO and of course and his cousin Augusto Lopez have this friendliness toward the cartels, but in Adán Augusto's case, again in the Guacamaya leaks, this hack that downloaded a bunch of, I think it was all Sedena information, correct? So it was sort of army specific stuff. But there's correspondence in there to the effect that when Adán Augusto Lopez was governor of Tabasco, he actually handed over the police files, the police personnel files of his own state police force to the Jalisco cartel, the Cartel Jalisciense Nueva Generación, right? And so which is a grotesque betrayal. I think we've mentioned it here on this podcast before. Yeah. But it's worth emphasizing, that's the guy who almost became president of Mexico last week. And there was a lot of alarm over it. Yeah. And during his time that he was kind of filling in for AMLO, he got to answer a few questions, and a lot of the mañaneras and press conferences were just panicked people asking about AMLO and his health. Right. But he did get to answer a few questions on other issues as well. And one of the questions that he was asked is, he was asked about Chihuahua Governor Maru Campos's recent request to the federal government to help with all of this migration that's flowing north. Yeah. And in this letter and in this request, she wrote that they were desperate, that they didn't have any of the resources that they needed to care for all of the people that were moving north. She also said that they were in charge of this humanitarian crisis that's only going to get worse and worse and worse. And she begged the federal government to step up and do something about it because that's their job. Right. Which sounds very, very familiar to something that we've been saying for a very long time. But what's interesting about this is his response to the question. And he responded by stressing that Mexico is a country of asylum and that it will always have its doors open to anyone that's fleeing from difficult situations in their home nations. And he also said that the federal government will, regardless of what they're asking for, will continue to guarantee migrants free passage through Mexico. So
what do you have you heard about this answer, or what do you think about the situation?
I heard about the appeal because I think you and I corresponded on it briefly, but I actually had not seen the answer, so that's very interesting to me. There's this idea that Mexico is always a country of asylum does have roots in a lot of 20th century Mexican history, and so there was a period. I think you can argue that Mexico plays this very positive role, essentially from the late 20s through really the 1940s. Mexico was sort of this haven for what I describe as anti-fascist. Europeans in particular, but you and I had a dinner with a distinguished gentleman whose parents or grandparents, I forget, were Polish Jews who came to Mexico and grandparents in the 1930s. And so that actually exists. That tradition exists. And if I had to guess, I certainly don't know Adán Augusto's intellectual background, but that might have been a reference to that, this idea that Mexico did take in all these people from Spanish Republicans in the 1930s to, Trotsky to, Jewish refugees, and, good for Mexico for doing that.
Right, yeah.
That's not what's happening in Mexico now, though.
No, not even close.
What's happening in Mexico now is it's effectively a transit country for, tremendous numbers, millions upon millions of individuals from, you name it, Venezuela, the Northern Triangle in Central America, Haiti and beyond, South Asia, East Asia, and so on, who are passing through. They're not coming. So this idea that Mexico is a place of asylum is not really illuminated by the case of who's coming now, because very few of any of these individuals are willingly staying in Mexico. Many of them are staying in Mexico, but it's because they're made to. But almost any one of them would pick up immediately and come to the United States, because that's the ultimate destination that gets them to Mexico, that makes them want to go. The unwillingness to shut that down, I think, is probably in the unwillingness to acquiesce to, what is obviously a very reasonable request by the governor of Chihuahua. Is probably rooted in that ideological background. It's rooted in sort of what I would describe as this very Morenista, very AMLO-related sense that you have to reject whatever it is the Americans want, which, we'll talk about that too. And it might be, this is me being extremely uncharitable, but we are talking about a guy who turned over his police force's own personnel files to the Jalisco cartel. Yeah. It might also be rooted in a desire to see the money continue to come rolling in through the human trafficking activities. And look, we know that the human traffickers in Mexico are not just the cartels. It also includes INM, which is the Instituto Nacional por Migración. Sedena is heavily involved. It's the Army in human trafficking. Yep. Guardia Nacional is heavily involved in human trafficking. And so there's all these, not just these extra governmental organizations that traffic people through Mexico, but also institutions of the government itself. And Adán Augusto oversees all of that. So you tell me what his interest is.
Well, thank you. That's a great perspective. And since we're talking about the border and the situation at the border, I want to use that to transition to this very terrifying article that you sent me. I think you sent it to me yesterday.
Oh, sure.
But it's the article about how the Mexican cartels, how they're orchestrating these human experiments in the Mexican border towns of Tijuana and Mexicali, I think. I think it was.
That's right.
But basically, the cartels are testing fentanyl on drug addicts so that they can figure out how to calculate what dosage they can use on the fentanyl that they're trafficking into the U.S. And there's a lot of interesting things about this. One, obviously, is that we've been told repeatedly that it's not a problem on the Mexican side, right? It's just a problem when it comes to Americans. I mean, AMLO has said this a ton of times, that we are the consumers, we're the ones that are having the problem, and that it's not consumed in Mexico.
We Americans.
We Americans.
The Americans
because of our lack of hugs, right?
Yes, of course.
And so that's one interesting thing about it, and I want to know what you think now about that. And I also have, I think, a few quotes that I got from that. But the other interesting thing about it is the actual facts. And so, as you know, 2 weeks ago, the DOJ indicted the Chapitos. Mm-hmm. And it was because of their fentanyl that they're trafficking into the U.S.
Right.
But the indictment said something interesting. And the indictment describes this case of a woman that was given 3 doses of fentanyl in Mexico, on the Mexican side. Mm-hmm. And it was done so that they could calculate the dosage of how much they could give a person without killing them. And she unfortunately died. She died of an overdose. But this indictment describes other things like that were happening, other occasions where people were tested on to see how much drugs, and these are vulnerable people, these are addicts,
Right.
but how much drugs their system could take before they died, before they overdosed.
Jeez.
And then these drugs were sent to the US anyway. So this article is unlike anything I've ever heard.
And that human testing is in the indictment as well, the Chapitos indictment.
These cases were, yeah.
These cases were okay.
The
Well,
indictment talks about these cases.
you
Yeah.
you have shown me up with your diligence because I did not read the Chapitos indictment. I just knew they were indicted. But I mean that's horrific. But it's consonant with the story in El País from yesterday,
Yeah.
stating that the cartels are using Tijuana and Mexicali as test beds where they can figure out, calculate fentanyl dosage, basically by performing, these macabre human experiments
Yeah.
on the poor, on the addicted, on the homeless in Mexico cities themselves. I mean, talk about the lower ends of the spectrum of human depravity. This is down there. I mean, this is something out of almost
horror movie.
Nazi Europe, right? Yeah, exactly. Like how much do we have to give you to kill you? And that's what they're doing. And I'd been told by a colleague that if you wanted to see where the fentanyl problem in Mexico is going in terms of the addiction and the use, then just Google fentanilo Tijuana, because apparently that was the epicenter. Well, now we know why it's the epicenter. It's the epicenter because that is the de facto population testing lab for the cartels. I think it's worth knowing, and we have to face what they are very squarely. These are not just market-based organizations. It's not just the mafia. Not that I'm excusing the mafia as any morally better, because the mafia too is detestable. But ultimately, there is sort of this sense, at least in its classic form, that the mafia is weirdly market-based, illegally market-based. Maybe trying to, in many ways, sort of circumvent the market through strong arm or extortionate tactics. But you get to a level of immorality, amorality. In the case of Mexican cartels, it's very hard to match anywhere, in traditional organized crime in the United States. And man, that's something we have to, frankly, extirpate.
Yeah.
With or without, candidly, the aid of AMLO's regime.
Yeah, absolutely. And, there's been this kind of fight of pointing fingers about who produces and who consumes. But a lot of people, even me, didn't realize that Tijuana has become this epicenter for fentanyl consumption.
Horrific.
I hadn't really heard that before.
Imagine that you are a woman, you're on the streets, you're homeless, let's say you suffered from domestic violence, or let's say, you economic hard times, and you're seized to become a human guinea pig for the cartels, and they will dose you with fentanyl until you die. And this happens over
horrific.
and over and over and over, and that is steps away from the United States. And who's to say it doesn't happen here? That to me, I'm glad, and I've praised El País's coverage before. El País, even though it's a Madrid-based newspaper, it has some of the best Mexico coverage out there, and this is a shining example of it. More people must know about this.
Absolutely. And what's another component of this that's really interesting is that Mexico doesn't really have any official statistics on drug use. And I was reading that Tijuana had a population of 500,000 drug addicts in 2018. And this is interesting because Mexico currently has no policy to address the situation. And apparently they haven't carried out a national addiction survey since then, in 5 years. So it's hard to gauge what the problem is. But the only way to try to do so is by talking to organizations down there that deal with a lot of these addicts.
Yeah.
And from what I've read, they're all saying that addiction has skyrocketed with the introduction of fentanyl, and that it's a huge problem and people are overdosing like crazy, but there's no way to have official numbers because they're not released. There's no survey on this. So do you think there's a real danger in not confronting the issue like Mexico's doing?
Yeah, por supuesto, right? I mean, look, the absence of statistics, the absence of metrics in Mexican civics no accident. We've seen AMLO in the past week, announced that he wants to shut down this governmental transparency agency, which is of a piece with him. INAI, thank you, which is of a piece with him shutting down INE, which is the electoral agency, and trying to basically defang the judiciary, the federal judiciary in Mexico. If you don't have stats, if you don't have data, if you don't have reporting and objective numbers, then it becomes quite difficult to critique his outcomes and critique his regime. And he knows that he's coming in to the final year of his regime, and he knows. I mean, he's cunning. He's not an ignorant man. He knows that the objective metrics are bad. Murder is up, addiction's up, crime is up. Every negative metric you can think of has skyrocketed under his rule, which is saying something considering where Mexico was before. It was already in a terrible place. He's left it much exponentially worse. And so the fact that they haven't surveyed addiction, the fact that it's impossible to know what's going on except by reference to NGOs and to civil society organizations is part and parcel of his design.
Yeah, like you say, the INAI stuff, it's like par for the course, right? It is like AMLO to attack the media, to attack government checks, to try to find this way to weaken democracy, to centralize power. And the INAI stuff is very interesting because he's just using the same excuse that he used for INE. He's saying that it's wasteful. He's saying that it's not necessary, that how much money they spend should be used to help the needy.
Right.
And he's also saying that they were created to simulate that something is being done about corruption.
Right.
And here's a direct quote from him. Not direct, this is translated.
Please.
But he says, "When has there been more corruption in Mexico? In the period that the Institute has been in operation, excluding our own time in office."
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Don't be mistaken.
Right.
But he's basically saying that this organization was created to act like someone is trying to tackle corruption.
Right.
But corruption has never been worse than with them.
It's such a basic error of causation. It's almost comical in a way.
Yeah.
But I'll bet you nobody in the Palacio Nacional challenged him on it. I would bet you.
Yeah, probably not. But he's saying that his administration is capable of dealing with all transparency requests without their help, and that there are a lot of institutions that can take it on without spending so much money.
Mm-hmm.
And he's really been trying, I think, for a couple of months or maybe even longer to scrap them. He, vetoed a request to put people in these new positions. I think they need 5 people in order to operate.
And he won't staff them.
Yeah, he won't staff them.
That's right.
Someone retired. So right now they're kind of, out of commission, I guess.
Yeah.
But I want to know your thoughts on what the real importance is behind this government checks and the transparency in a government.
It's just like we said earlier, it's part and parcel of what he's been doing the entire time, which is kicking out the props from the Mexican state. Mexico had a transition to democracy. There's no other way to put it. In the 1990s, along with much of the rest of the world, and the Mexican transition was not easy. I would argue that it's one of the more admirable transitions because they didn't. There's a lot of things that could have gone wrong in Mexico in the 1990s that did not go wrong. But honestly, throughout the 1990s, you had sort of like the worst year as 1994 when Colosio was assassinated. We talked about him in a previous podcast. And then you had the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas.
Yeah.
But after that, the Mexican, you have to give credit to Mexican civil society, and I give it in full. They established these independent institutions knowing that there needed to be some kind of a nonpartisan, non-partial oversight, independent from elected office holders, to oversee elections and data gathering at minimum, basic transparency. And then they actually allowed an opposition candidate to win the presidency in 2000. And so what AMLO is doing, you have to understand, is unwinding all of that. He's ending that period. Mexicans had, I hate to be apocalyptic about it, but from 1990 through basically 2020-ish, circa both dates, Mexicans had a hope and an expectation that they would be an open liberal democracy. That started to fade in 2006 with the beginning of the modern Mexican drug war, which is a tragedy unto itself. But it's really coming to an end now that the state and the office holders and the federal government itself are closing out the institutions that allowed this flowering of dissent and elections in civil society to come forth. And that is just a terrific tragedy, and it's one whose effects, kind of per our opening conversation in this podcast, are going to be felt in the United States sooner or later.
Yeah. And we talk about accountability a lot, right? But this kind of transparency is exactly what's needed to hold any government accountable.
Oh, yeah.
But shifting gears on that a little bit, and speaking of how much AMLO hates his critics or anyone that opposes him, I want to talk about what you sent me yesterday. This letter that AMLO showed at his mañanera, and he's been, showing off, where he asks Biden to basically stop funding the U.S. Agency for International Development.
Right.
Saying that they're basically financing these organizations that oppose what he stands for or what his government is aiming to do. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
AMLO is, I don't know how else to put it, AMLO is at war with the United States. He has decided, for whatever reason, again, known only unto him, that he has got to go full rhetorical guns blazing versus the United States. And so what has he done? He gave the speech in Veracruz that we talked about, in which he promised to defend cartels from American action. He has, sent the letter that you talk about to President Biden, basically saying that the United States government is funding critics of himself. And in his mind, causing
organizations
dissent
hostile to his government.
Organizations hostile to his government. Yes, right. Who's in the hostility, in his view, is normal. What we would regard as Americans as normal civic criticism. So that's happening. He has bragged about. Apparently, there was another Chinese spy balloon, or what's believed to be another Chinese spy balloon, that passed over Mexican territory. And according to him, it is Mañanera yesterday, the U.S. Department of Defense asked for permission to enter Mexican airspace to investigate it, which honestly would have been granted under any of his predecessors in full candor. And AMLO bragged about saying no, we didn't allow it. We did not allow it. The Americans couldn't come into airspace. So, well, congratulations.
So proud of it.
Congratulations, Andres. You've had a Chinese spy balloon go over, and the one power that could have done something about it, basically did nothing. Because to our credit, we respected the denial of airspace. It's fine. We're good neighbors. But I don't think AMLO's regime is. I have to read you this quote because now everybody knows that he is just on a complete rip and a complete tear against the United States. Like something has triggered within him. I guess I'll credit Representatives Crenshaw and Waltz with bringing about the fruition of his paranoia. He says, this is at a couple of mañaneras back. He says, el gobierno de los Estados Unidos tiene muchas agencias y muchas de esas agencias, lo digo de manera respetuosa, no actúan con rectitud, no respetan, actúan con mucha prepotencia. And so this is basically saying, they've got, I know, right? Yeah. They've got agencies upon agencies, and they act essentially without respect. Correct my Spanish if I'm getting it wrong. But it's basically saying they act without respect, they act with arrogance, they act with no regard for soberanía, the sovereignty of Mexico. And AMLO's saying, we're done with it. We're done with American arrogance and this and that. Well, the reason he's done with it is, of course, because he himself is tied to the cartels, and he doesn't want the Americans digging into that. But it is remarkable to me the misread that is contained within AMLO's decision to go after the United States, because the Biden administration really doesn't want to do anything about Mexico or about AMLO or about the Morena regime, anything like that. The Biden administration is in sort of deer in the headlights mode and always has been vis-a-vis the border.
Exactly.
And they just want to be able to ignore it. That really is the overall driving preference. They don't have any interest in promoting Mexican democracy. They have sort of, some of the bureaucrats within them have sort of this reflex toward a green agenda or promoting LGBTQIA+ in Mexico, which frankly Claudia Sheinbaum would willingly cooperate with anyway. But all things told, AMLO is continually, making these increasingly difficult to ignore provocations and insults toward Washington, D.C. and toward the U.S. federal government. And I have to wonder where he thinks it's going to end. I don't think it's going to end where he thinks it's going to end.
No, I don't. And since you shared a quote, I want to share, before we move on to a different topic, I want to share his quote also on this.
Okay.
He said, the U.S. government, specifically through USAID, has for some time been financing organizations openly against the legal and legitimate government that I represent. This is clearly an interventionist act, contrary to international law and the relations which should prevail between free and sovereign states. And then another quote that one was in the letter. Another quote that wasn't in the letter is, I hope that a review is made of this interventionist policy because it is offensive, it's arrogant, it's acting as if what as if one were the owner of the entire American continent. And I think this is kind of funny because we just talked about the Monroe Doctrine last week.
Oh, yeah.
But he basically came out and said that the Monroe Doctrine, America for the Americans, remains the beacon of U.S. foreign policy, and that is why we have frictions with them.
Well, I wish he were right about that.
Yeah.
It clearly doesn't, but we would be in a better place if the Monroe Doctrine remained a beacon of American foreign policy. But look, we're talking about a guy who fulminates against the United States, but has no problem with the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, you name it, the Cubans operating in Mexico against the United States. So my sympathy is quite small, and I don't think I am out of bounds by saying that he is being disingenuous in his critique.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And you talked a little bit about the Veracruz speech already.
Right.
But I want to touch a little bit more on that, and I want you to share a little about Greg's op-ed that was posted. It was posted last week, right?
Sure.
It was posted last week. It's titled "AMLO Sides with the Cartels," which I think is very appropriate because he was saying in his Veracruz speech that he will use the Mexican state and the Mexican military to defend cartels from the Americans.
That's right.
So can you tell us a little bit more about what Greg, which for our listeners, Greg is our wonderful CEO here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation.
Yes.
So can you fill us in on his op-ed?
Yeah, Greg Sindelar, CEO and president here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, had this piece that you mentioned in the Spectator World. So if you go to Spectator, you can find it there on AMLO siding with the cartels. And it uses the Veracruz speech as kind of a news hook and a launch point to talk a little bit more about what U.S. policy toward Mexico needs to be. And, concurrent with what we at the Foundation have advocated for quite a long time, we need to have a reality-based policy. Nobody in the Foundation, and I would argue no meaningful cohort in the United States, is hostile toward Mexico as such. We recognize, especially those of us who are Texan, recognize, and we've said this many, many times on the podcast, Mexico is a neighbor. It's always going to be one. Geography is what it is. And cultural interchange is what it is too. I'm half Mexican. And so we proceed with great regret at any negative conclusion vis-a-vis Mexico and the Mexican state. But that regret does not override the imperative to realism. And so understanding what Mexico is, understanding what the current Mexican president is, and knowing that he will almost certainly, I would say 99%, choose a successor who is either as bad as him or controlled by him, we need to make policy accordingly. And so what Greg Sindelar talks about in his op-ed is what that policy might look like. And we think that two of the ideas that need to be on the table our foreign terror designation for Mexican cartels, which would, probably involve figuring out what the judicious use of the U.S. Armed Forces is.
Right.
And then, on the other hand, an Article 1, Section 10 constitutional declaration of invasion by the state of Texas, which we've long stood for. And so just thinking about those things, we think gets policymaking into the proper place, proceeding from the proper premises. And, hopefully we don't have to use any of this, right? But we would be abdicating in our duty of stewardship as those who engage in policymaking in the United States, not to squarely face what reality is now.
Yeah, needs to be on the table.
It does.
And we've been saying that for a long time. And that's why it's great that Greg is writing about it. And so many people on both sides of the aisle are agreeing that Mexico, the Mexican state, at least, is no longer a partner, and they're on their way to becoming much worse.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think you make a really good point there. That's worth emphasizing. That this really isn't a left-right issue. It's not a Democrat-Republican issue either. It has been very interesting to me to see that although there is not policy consensus, there's not consensus on what we ought to do about Mexico, even within the conservative movement. It's a very heterogeneous, set of opinions on that, which is great. It's fine. Let 1,000 schools of thought contend. The analysis of what's happening, the common propositions, the understanding that, yes, this is what's happening in Mexico and this is why, is increasingly universal, not just among those of us on the right, but also among many of our friends on the left. I have now spoken with former Biden administration officials, folks with whom we profoundly disagree, respectfully, but nevertheless profoundly disagree on like immigration policy, for example. Nevertheless, will affirm that their understanding of what's happening to the Mexican state is the same as ours, and I think that's pretty telling.
Yeah, I think so too. We've even seen very leftist writers coming out and writing articles about this. So that's been something that's very unexpected, but
It tells you where we are.
A big development that tells you where we are. Yeah. So how about, I want to talk about the violence in Tamaulipas. How about this crazy stuff that's happening in Tamaulipas? In the last couple days, there's not really been a lot of official reporting on it. There's not been really any articles that I've been able to find on it. But Twitter has been showing us that what's happening in Tamaulipas is an absolute war zone.
Twitter is en fuego.
Yeah, Twitter. Yeah. And you won't be able to find a lot about it on Google. It's not being reported. But the videos on Twitter are showing that the roads are blocked, that there's being shootouts, and that there's these cartel convoys, these armored vehicles are called monstruos.
Around.
Yeah,
it
looks like out of an actual war zone.
Yeah.
And what I think is what's happening, what we've been able to deduce from all of these reports and like people that are there, is that there's a fight for control over drug trafficking territories. And I wasn't very familiar about like which cartels are over which territories, but I did a little bit of research about it.
Please.
And it seems that the problem is that the area of Tamaulipas has been dominated by the Gulf Cartel for a really long time.
Correct.
And their armed wing, the Zetas, right? And so this is their region, but the problem now is that the Jalisco Cartel Nueva Generación, the CJNG,
right,
seem to be making some inroads into the south of Tamaulipas.
That's
and
right.
They wanted to clean house. So it seems that now this cartel is on offense and it's going after the Gulf Cartel.
Yeah.
And that's what's causing all of this fighting, all of these shootouts, all of these roads being blocked. And I think what's also very interesting, I want to know what else you've heard, but what's also interesting is that we're being told by politicians, we're being told by the Mexican government that everything is fine, that everything's under control, that there's nothing bad happening. And they seem to avoid wanting to have this conversation.
But they're also saying, the same people who are saying that are also saying, do not go out after sundown.
Yeah, apparently
right.
like schools were closed as well.
Right.
But they're telling us that everything's fine, that it's being exaggerated. Even the president, AMLO, said that it was some sort of attempt to make the governor look bad, like a political attempt.
Who's a Morena governor?
Yeah.
Yeah, who's a Morena governor who's known to have been funded by
exactly
the cartels.
Yeah,
right.
exactly.
Right.
So what else have you seen about this? And do you think that this is just them trying to shove something under the rug that is the direct repercussion of the hugs, not bullets?
Oh yeah, of course,
policy?
Of course. I mean, like, so Tamaulipas. For those of you who don't know where Tamaulipas is the state that basically borders Texas from essentially the mouth of the Rio Grande and the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to effectively Laredo. And it's the old Tamaulipas is the old Nuevo Santander that we've talked about several times. It's coterminous with its territory, and so it's got this kind of spit of land on the south end of the Rio Grande that would, had Mexico not lost Texas, would have cut across an oasis, and that would have been core Tamaulipas. So when you think about Tamaulipas, you're actually thinking about a population that's the same founding population as exists in South Texas. And we opened this episode by talking about the Lower Rio Grande Valley. So this is the same people, same cultural milieu. Tamaulipas has never been particularly safe. I personally have not set foot in Tamaulipas since 2011. I was in Matamoros for a breakfast. I just don't remember if I've talked about this on the podcast before.
No, you haven't, but you've talked about it to me. So why don't you share?
Yeah, I may have. The very short version is I was having breakfast in Matamoros with a journalist, and there was probably a cartel lookout who was there. It was quite early in the morning, and we got spotted. I stand out in Mexico, and so we had to they read out. And so we had to hightail it for the international bridge, and that's also where I found out that I needed a coin to drop in the turnstile to head back north, which is a little bit of a high tension moment for me. But look, Tamaulipas is, for obvious reasons, an epicenter of cartel activity. You're correct. It's traditionally controlled by Cartel del Golfo, Cartel del Noreste. The Zetas, which I think were described in the news story as kind of their armed wing, they sort of float in and out depending on what incarnation they're in, as either subsidiaries of these cartels or as independent actors on their own. So, we have to understand these are very fluid organizations that change over time. It does look like what's happening now over the past week is that, and I've heard the same thing you have. And by the way, neither of us can verify this, but this is kind of what's been reported, which is that the Jaliscienses are making their move to take over Tamaulipas. Now it's obvious why they're doing it. There's no money like the money you get from controlling a border crossing, and this is a big one. This is a big one. And something like 40% of U.S. international trade goes through Laredo. So it's just it is a big deal to get to control this. Who knows? I mean, there's nobody to root for in this case because they're both bad guys. But this sort of open warfare is going on. What you recount, I think, illuminates something extremely important to understand. You mentioned that you can't find news reporting on it. That's because there is no news reporting on it. Mexico being, I think, either the deadliest or second most deadly nation in the world for journalists. Actually, I think it's the deadliest nation in the world for journalists. It is. So it's the worst. It's the worst place. Formal journalism, especially in a place like Tamaulipas, Mexico City, you'll probably get some coverage, but Tamaulipas, you won't get any coverage of it. Anybody who tries to cover it in a journalistic capacity is going to be killed. So the news and the reporting all has to come from social media, and it's got to be from anonymized accounts. Because there have been plenty of examples of individuals who have tweeted something or posted on Facebook and cartel activities, and the cartel guys. They do it for the Insta too, and they'll come and they'll find people who criticize them on social media and they'll kill them.
Hunt you down.
They'll hunt you down, and then they'll post it on social media, right? So finding this out, this is sort of the veil of unknowing that descends upon places and episodes like this. We know something's happening. We know there's a scenario of effectively open warfare, within Tamaulipas. We know that these convoys with the monstros are, traveling from place to place. We know there's gun battles. We know there's bloqueos. We know all this is happening, but we can't get a grip on it, because it is seen through a glass darkly. You get bits and pieces, the odd tweet, the odd Instagram post, some of them from the cartels themselves. And so what we can say for sure is there's great violence. And we can also say that the state governor, who, in theory has the stewardship of his own citizenry and people and is responsible for their safety, is denying that it's there. And why would he not? These are the people who funded him to begin with.
Yeah. And it's $7 million, by the way.
That
money that
cartels?
allegedly came from the Cartel de Noreste for Américo Villarreal's campaign.
What a sound investment they made.
No pocket change, though. It's a lot of money.
That's right, yeah.
But I want to share a quote with you. Mm-hmm. We can't really go into all of this because it could take an entire podcast on its own.
Sure.
But it's a quote from the president of Salvador, Bukele.
Sure.
And he said, not relating to this, but I just thought it was pertinent. He said, cuando un gobierno no combate efectivamente la criminalidad, no es porque no tenga la capacidad de hacerlo, sino porque los cómplices de los criminales son los que están en el gobierno. And that in English for our listeners is, when a government does not effectively combat criminality, it is not because it lacks the capacity to do so, but because the accomplices of criminals are those who are in the government.
That's right.
So I just thought that was...
I agree with it. I hesitate to join in the Bukele fan club because I still have this nagging feeling that I don't know enough to say one way or the other. But I'll give him this. He's saying the right things.
Yeah. And I know there's a lot of people that love him. I've heard that from so many people that are just his number one fans now.
He's become like this base thing. It's weird. If you told me that in 2023 I would approve of statements from the president of El Salvador and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. On various topics, I would never have believed you. It's almost an example of how topsy-turvy things have become. But Bukele's objectively correct, and he's describing not just El Salvador but Mexico and the rest of the region.
Right, so much of Latin America. But we'll have to talk about El Salvador in a different podcast.
Let's do it.
But I want to ask you about something else before we end, and that is a day that a lot of Americans will be celebrating tomorrow. Yes. Where
I'm opening my phone so I can read the quote on it.
Yes, please do. But I know tomorrow is a day that we're all going to be eating too much, drinking too much, partying too much, and that's Cinco de Mayo. So can you tell us a little bit about what the heck it is and what it actually stands for and what it represents?
Well, I just want to interject. Those of you who will be eating and drinking too much are the ones without 9 and 7-year-old children
That's
at home.
Right.
So I will be wrestling, wrangling kids. Cinco de Mayo. Everybody thinks it's the Mexican holiday. It's not. It's not really celebrated in Mexico.
Some people think it's Independence Day. Like a lot of Americans actually think that.
Correct. Yeah, it's not Independence Day. Independence Day is September 15th with the grito. mean, I'm just kind of curious. Did Cinco de Mayo come up in Bolivia? There's no reason it would have.
Never.
Never heard of it,
I
right?
didn't know what it was.
Okay, well, right. So, which is probably true for a lot of Mexicans too. Cinco de Mayo it does have one important thing from a Texan perspective. The general who won the Battle of Puebla on May 5th, 1862, Ignacio Zaragoza was a native-born Texan. So if you go to Goliad, you can see the statue of Ignacio Zaragoza, and he, in fact, you were just telling me, which I did not know, that they renamed Puebla de Zaragoza. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was named after him.
Well, I mean, fantastic. You know, good for him.
That's why the big party is there every year.
Well, sure. So we should set the historical context, because I want to read a quote from Dr. Jill Biden, our eminent First Lady, on Cinco de Mayo. So Cinco de Mayo, essentially what happens in 1862 is the French invade Mexico. I'm skipping over a lot. The French invade Mexico, and to invade Mexico, you land at Veracruz, you go to Puebla, and then once you control Veracruz and Puebla, that supply line, then you can move on the Valley of Mexico and Mexico City, which is kind of the whole prize.
Yeah.
So the French try to do this, and at the Battle of Puebla on May 5th, 1862, the Mexicans under Zaragoza repulse the French force. Now the French come back later and they win it and everything, but it's a victory. There's a bit of I guess kind of a mini controversy going on right now, because I guess the White House this year in Washington, D.C., our White House, is not going to commemorate Cinco de Mayo. It typically does. There's typically something for it, and so it's a little bit unusual that there isn't. And I don't know why. I mean, we can speculate. When I was working in the Bush administration as a baby speechwriter, we did do a Cinco de Mayo celebration, and so I got to shake the hands of the president, because they invited all of the Hispanic Schedule C appointees there, and so it was my only interaction with President Bush. As he kind of looked at me and he said, "This is for the Hispanic employees." Yeah, and I was like, "Well, yes, sir. Thanks. I know. I'm half Mexican." But I want to read, just for comedy value, I want to read Dr. Jill Biden's speech, just a passage from her speech on Cinco de Mayo 2022, last year's Cinco de Mayo.
Let's hear it.
I have to read it. So this is Dr. Jill Biden. See, I'm using the honorific.
As you should.
As I should.
Yeah.
So this is what the First Lady says. The Battle of Puebla, which Cinco de Mayo celebrates, lasted only for a single day. Defending the small town of central Mexico wasn't a major strategic victory in the Franco-Mexican War. But the fact that a ragtag group of soldiers outnumbered 3-1 could defeat Napoleon's French Foreign Legion was a victory of the heart. I love this. I love this passage. I mean, it's pure bathos, for one thing, but it's so riddled with historical error that it almost exemplifies just the intellectual power and heft that this White House brings to foreign affairs. And there's three things that I love about the passage. I mean, first, that nobody on the First Lady's, Dr. Jill Biden's, speechwriting staff or research staff knew why the Battle of Puebla happened. She says it wasn't a major strategic victory. Actually, it was. It's very important to seize Puebla, which is why every invader of Mexico for the past 500 years has had to do it. From Cortez, although Puebla didn't exist then, but it was Cholula and the environs, to the United States Army in 1846, 1847, and then to the French themselves. And then, of course, we talked about the 1914 Intervención in Veracruz, which would have been prelude to marching on Mexico City in some concepts,
right?
Which also would have involved taking Puebla. So that's one thing that they got wrong, that Puebla is extremely strategic. It is a strategic outcome action. The other thing, she says that the Mexicans defeated, quote, Napoleon's French Foreign Legion. Well, the French Foreign Legion was not present in Mexico on May 5th, 1862. And I bring this up, not to be nitpicky, but just to illuminate the depth of profound ignorance that pervades our leadership class, well, on almost any subject, but absolutely on Mexican affairs. And if this attention to detail is absent in something like a First Lady address, it is assuredly absent in real policy making. And it is into that gap that this podcast tries to step, this foundation tries to step, in order to bring some realism and information to a very serious topic.
Yeah. And is the part about them being like very outnumbered and the Mexican soldiers being like not foreseen to be able to?
I believe that's true.
That part's true?
I believe that's true. I don't know about the 3-1 figure. I didn't double check that. But I was bowled over by the rest of the factual error. So
that's so interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Thanks. I also thought I was researching, what Mexicans do on Cinco de Mayo, because I was so interested by it. And it's really just a very regional holiday. It's just celebrated in Puebla. Sure. You won't see people celebrating it anywhere else, and they call it La Batalla de Puebla. which I thought was very, very funny because the United States makes it like a coast-to-coast celebration, and apparently it started in California when they heard about what happened in that area of Puebla on Cinco de Mayo, and they heard, that the Mexican army was so outnumbered and so outmanned, and that they managed to win anyway. And so they heard about it. People took to the streets. They started partying.
It was a California celebration.
It began in California.
I didn't know that. That's interesting. Okay.
So maybe that's why it's so big in the U.S. right now.
Well, congratulations to California for once again taking somebody else's thing and making it big.
And making it their own.
Yeah.
I'm not mad though. It's a fun celebration.
That's fine.
But I think that we're almost out of time, but I just want to wrap up with one last thing. For those of our listeners who don't know, we got the very sad news last week that Alejandro Hope passed away.
Yes.
We've talked about him on the podcast before. I think the last time that we brought up one of his columns was when we were talking about the Tamaulipas stuff, the Mexicans that were murdered there.
That's right.
But he was, a wonderful security analyst. We loved reading his stuff. I mean,
Absolutely.
We loved following him on Twitter, and
Absolutely.
we had the privilege of meeting with him before as well when we were in Mexico, and it's just absolutely tragic that he's passed, and we just wanted to share that with our listeners.
Yeah, no, thank you, and thank you for making a point of mentioning that, Melissa, because it is important. It is important to know. Alejandro Hope, of all the things that you and I talk about, I'll speak for myself. On this, the work that I do is but a shadow of the work of a man like Alejandro Hope, who, unlike me, I'm a U.S. citizen. I don't have to live in Mexico. He was a very, very proud Mexican patriot who lived and worked in his home country to make it better. He spoke fearlessly. He told the truth about the relationship between the Mexican state and cartels and was very candid about it. He leaves behind a wife and family. I don't think we know the cause of death, but regardless of what it was, he was quite young, wasn't he? He was maybe 50.
He was 52, I think.
So I'm at the age where 52 is going to qualify as young on an honorary standpoint. But he, it's a terrific blow to those of us who care about Mexico and about a Mexican society and state that is decent and just toward its own citizenry. And so, we at the Hard Country and at the Texas Public Policy Foundation honor his memory, and we are grateful for the aid that he gave us in understanding his own country when he lived.
Absolutely. It's so tragic, and he will be missed.
Absolutely.
But on that note, I think that we can wrap up. So thank you to all of our listeners. We will see you next time.